start with some notes. I'm going to attempt to figure out the recordings again this year. It took me a while last year to figure it out. Okay. All right, so we're going to want to talk about the philosophy that is going to really impact the American form of government. So now we're going to talk about some other theories of government by classifying different forms of government. And we're going to classify government 3 different ways. So this is going to be way number 1. And this way of classifying government is by the direction of power. Where does power flow? Can somebody raise your hand if you can remember the name or the fancy word for power? Don't say it, just raise your hand. Everybody, if you know it, raise your hand. What is that fancy word for power that we learned? Only one person remembers, 2 people remember, 3 people remember the fancy word for power? 4. That's pretty rough. Would you turn to your neighbor and see if you can remember what that fancy word for power is? Oh. All right, we had some moments of realization. Elena, can you help me? Sovereignty is that fancy word, right? So which direction does sovereignty flow? And you can see on the board there are 3 different versions of the way that could work. If sovereignty, meaning all power, flows from the central government, then we call that a unitary form of government, because there is only one, unitary like unicycle and unicorn, only one source of sovereignty, only one source of power. So it is possible in a unitary form of government to have other sub-governments. We might have city councils, we might have county coordinators, we can have other sub-governments, but do they have inherent sovereignty? Yes or no? Nod your head. In a unitary form of government, do sub-governments have inherent sovereignty? No, they don't, because all sovereignty comes from where in a unitary form of government? From that central government. All sovereignty originates from that one central government. Now we're going to skip the sort of middle ground for a moment, and we're going to go straight to Confederation. In a confederation, all sovereignty rests in what we would consider the sub-governments. You guys know about the American Confederacy, right? And although it's not exactly historically accurate, the story goes that the American Confederacy was all about states' rights, right? The states wanted more power than the national government. So in a confederacy, each sub-government, like a state, in our understanding, or a county or a region, has the sovereignty. And although a national or central government does exist, it doesn't have any power of its own, right? The only power that central government has is the power that is given to it by those sub-governments, or we might call them states. So in a confederation, it's the opposite of a unitary system, right? Confederation is the opposite of a unitary system. In a unitary system, the central government has all the power, but might create sub-governments for its own purposes by sharing sovereignty with them. In a confederation, all the power rests in those sub-governments, the various states, for example. And they're going to create a central government, but the only authority or power or sovereignty that it has is the power that those states or sub-governments choose to give to it. But then we have a different system. It's called a federal system. We have a federal system. And in a federal system, both the states and the national government have their own inherent sovereignty. So under our government, we believe that the national government has sovereignty, has powers that it has just because it's a national government, and we believe that the states have some sovereignty. An important way to understand this is to ask yourself, can one dissolve the other? In a confederation, can the states dissolve the central government? They can, because the central government had no inherent sovereignty. It only exists because they want it to. If they decide they don't want it to exist, it ceases to exist. In a unitary form of government, can the central government dissolve the state governments? It can, because the states have no inherent sovereignty. They only get power because the central government gave it to them. But in a federal form of government, neither the states nor the national government can dissolve the other. In our country, the national government can't abolish Texas. That's not going to happen. Nor can the South, though they might want to, abolish the national government. They're stuck with each other because they both have independent sources of sovereignty. Now you might guess that gets complicated now and then, and you would be right. It does get very complicated. And we're going to talk later about the different ways that the state and national governments share power in our system. The second way to classify government is how power is divided. And I just said division of or separation of power is what philosophers should you be thinking of? Montesquieu, that's right. So when we talk about how we're dividing powers, there are two basic forms of government we can talk about. One is a presidential system, and one is a parliamentary system. And there's these handy-dandy diagrams. Remember, if you wanted to have this exact image, where could you find it? Schoology, absolutely. You can find this exact image at Schoology if you need it. But so first we'll start with a presidential form of government. In a presidential form of government, the legislative and executive branches are separate. I'm not going to talk more about that because I think you understand that because we're here in America, right? Everyone knows what that means. For legislative branch, that's Congress. And the executive branch, that's the president and the bureaucracy, they are separate. They don't work together. They don't rely on one another. They're separate. But in a parliamentary system, it doesn't work that way. Most democracies are actually parliamentary systems. It tends to be run a bit more smoothly, although that can have problems of its own. In a parliamentary system, the voters elect the legislature, and then within the legislature itself, the legislators will choose someone to be their leader, usually called the prime minister. And that prime minister, therefore, is dependent upon and has to work with the legislature at all times. And if this leader, the executive, the prime minister, ever falls out of favor or does something the legislature doesn't like, what happens to him or her? Right? All done. They have to leave. Vote of no confidence, whatever it is, they got to go, and the legislature appoints a new executive, a new prime minister, who's going to do what they want. So you can see how these two kinds of governments would function differently, right? I mean, like, if Congress could get rid of President Obama right now, they probably would have done it like 7.5 years ago. But they can't because we have separation of powers between the executive and legislative branches. In a parliamentary system, that does not exist. There is usually a separate judiciary in a parliamentary system, so it's not correct to say that a parliamentary system has no separation of powers. That's not accurate, because generally parliamentary systems will have an independent judiciary. But when we talk about separation of power, we're talking about the division between the executive, that's the person in charge of enforcing the laws, and legislature, the people in charge of making the laws. Nod your head, please, if you understand the difference between a presidential and a parliamentary system. All right, very good. And probably last but not least for today, the third way to classify government is by what role the people have in that government. And there are really three basic ways to do this. The people could have no role. That's a dictatorship. Monarchs of the world don't like to be called dictators, but they are if the people have no voice in their government. If people have no role in the government, that's a dictatorship. If the people have 100% of the power, if it's the people's voice or the common will that determines the direction of government, that's called a direct democracy. A direct democracy. When the people have all the power, then that's called a direct democracy. But since that can get pretty complicated and also a little bit dicey in the whole protecting the rights of the minorities thing, more often we're going to see something called a republic. When you write the word republic, please write the words representative democracy next to it. When you write the word republic, please write representative democracy right next to it. In a republic, the people vote for their representatives, and then those representatives then vote and participate in the creation of policies or laws. So there's a step between the will of the people and the actual policies that go into place, which tends to have a bit of like a conservative effect, and to slow down the pace of change. Any question about how power can be divided in terms of the role of the people? All right, then we have probably just about a few seconds before the music plays me off. So if you would, in your last few seconds, turn to your partner and tell them, going back to the presidential and parliamentary system, tell them which side you think works best. Do you think the presidential system is the best? Or parliamentary system is the best? So what side? Never mind, think about it, and we'll come back on Monday.